Hello there, reminders. Welcome back to the Mind of Watercolor. Well, MG is helping me get set up here for what I thought was an episode I did a long time ago. You know those things that you do that you imagine that you did that then kind of become reality in your brain as if you actually did it? Well, that's what this episode's going to be. We're going to talk about blooms and backruns. There's actually a psychological term. I think it's called false memory syndrome. Actually, I thought there would be a fancier word for it than that. What do you think, MG? Should I make up my own term? Yeah, I think I want to call it something a little more interesting, like deja didn't. I like that. So this episode is a deja didn't. All right, thanks for your help, MG. All right, so let's talk about blooms and backruns. Actually, two terms for the same thing. I know I'm blowing you away with my high-tech titles here. It's called Sharpie. So I know everyone has experienced these. And if you're a rank beginner, you may not even understand or know what they are. Chances are, if you are a beginner, this is going to be one of the first things you run into where you go, oh my goodness, what just happened? All right, let's talk about what it is first and demonstrate what it is. I'm going to put some transparent red iron oxide down here. Get the paper nice and wet. Now, if you're an experienced watercolorist, you know that there are various drying stages at which things will happen at various intervals. Paint tends to move the most at this very wet stage, where all the paint looks very glossy. Different pigments will move at different rates, and as it dries, paint moves less and less. But one of the key factors in painting with watercolor is water management. A lot of beginners come into, this is sort of a general tip, not necessarily about backruns, but a lot of beginners come into watercolor thinking there's a certain amount of water I should use and a certain amount of paint. And I do all my painting that way. It's not. There's actually an infinite amount of water, seemingly infinite, I guess I should say, in terms of ratios. So you're always adjusting the pigment or the water. Now, I'm letting this dry a little bit, or I should say I'm letting it soak into the paper a little bit. And what I'm going to try to do here is create the exact conditions for a backrun. You can see as the water soaks in, the sheen becomes a little less glossy, but I'm going to wait just a little bit longer. It's still very, very damp, very wet, but it's not glossy wet, so not a lot of water sitting on top. So what happens is when a brush full of water or paint with a lot of water comes in and begins to paint, it starts to push back the pigment that's there. I'm not getting a super dramatic backrun here. I'm just going to try to force the situation. This happens a lot. Beginners will come in and they have a wash down and it's starting to dry, and they'll just bring in more paint with a whole lot of water. And then all of a sudden, instead of getting a smooth wash, they're getting these. Let me paint another one. I know most of you experienced painters know what these are. What we're going to talk about, though, in a minute is how to become more familiar with them and even look for them and use them as an effect. This paint up here on the edge has already dried and soaked into a fairly stable state. And that's what you want to get to know with backruns, is at what stage does the paint become stable if you were to enter with another wetter wash. And honestly, you just have to experiment. But just to reiterate, it is a difference in the amount of water. A significant amount of water has soaked in and you're adding more water, and it acts like a bulldozer. It just pushes that pigment back. Now, something like this, as subtle as this is, you can actually fix it on good cotton paper. You can lightly come in to a degree and even it out. There are some backruns though that just pretty much you can't do a whole lot with. All right, let's see where we are in this one. I'm going to bring in a brush loaded with clean water. A lot of times beginners will get them when they're painting something else, like coming in with another color and painting up to an edge, and then they'll wonder why that water is like pushing all this pigment back. Instead of blending, it's like, what's it doing? This appears to be a very stable color, so it's not happening a whole lot. Let's try it with ultramarine blue. Maybe that's dark. Maybe you can see it even better. And the reason I'm spending a lot of time actually trying to create one is because that's helpful, and it's something I really strongly recommend you do. Go in and learn how to create a backrun. It is the best way to figure out how to stop them. So now I'm getting a good one right here. I just basically have almost a puddle of water sitting on top. It's just taking that pigment that's on top and is moving it back. All right, this still has a lot of sheen on it, but I'm going to try it anyway. Well, I have a nice one that kind of came out there. Or terrible one, depending on how you look at it. This may be too wet, because if the water can disperse into the water that's there evenly, you won't see much of a backrun. It has to do with a difference in wetness and how much pigment is sitting on top, and that's another factor, because it's how much sizing or the type of paper, because sizing differs from paper to paper. So it has to do a lot with how much pigment is actually sitting on top of the paper. As an aside, because of the pigment sitting on top of the paper, the effect usually happens a lot more often on non-cotton paper, which is one reason why a lot of beginners run into this and they go, oh my goodness, what just happened? Is because a lot of beginners were using less expensive paper. So this is pulp paper. It's in a Stillman and Burn sketchbook. It's a good line and wash paper, but let's take a look at what happens with a backwash. And I hope you can see that all right. A lot more dramatic effect on non-cotton paper. And it's simply because it's not as absorbent. It doesn't disperse water as well as cotton paper, and more pigment sits up on top of the paper. I don't need to talk about my love of cotton paper and how much I think you should be using it. That's for another time, and I've talked about that in plenty of videos. But if you are using non-cotton paper and you're getting a lot of backruns, that's the reason. Okay, let me show you this. This is, by the way, B 100% cotton paper. This is cold press. I brought in a piece of Arch's hot press right here that I had a scrap of. And this is a situation that you'll encounter backruns on a lot. You have a drying wash, and you're coming in with a different color, or you're trying to blend out an edge, but you're using too much water. You actually should be using very little water, probably less water than's on the paper if you're trying to blend out an edge. But when you use too much water, it comes in here and does that. And that's a backrun. And I can't tell you how many beginners have said, what in the world am I doing wrong? What happened? You know, I was just trying to blend it. It's like, well, use too much water. Decrease your water as you try to blend. So if I use less water in the brush, just a damp brush primarily, I'm not going to be pushing back that pigment with this tidal wave of excess water coming in. And then I can easily bring that edge out into a soft blend. And that's something that if you're having trouble with it, you just need to practice it. Blending an edge with too much water will give you this result. And I'm exaggerating it here for effect. Well, let's recap a little bit. A backrun, just for definition, a backrun is too much water coming into a damp or wet area, an excessive amount of water, more water than is there, more moisture than is there, and pushing back the pigment. Two very dramatically different levels of water. You have a lot more forgivability, as you can see, on cotton paper than you do on non-cotton paper. So that's just an aside. I like to do backwashes or show backwashes on non-cotton paper because you can really, really dramatically see what they look like. Now, this is exactly what you should do. If you're a beginner and you don't really understand blooms or backruns, you should do these kind of little laboratory experiments. I mean, I have taught myself so much by doing these kind of things. I've got stacks and stacks of little scraps like this. And you're just teaching yourself what happens, how granulation. I mean, look at there. There's a lot of granulation. There's a lot of granulation there. Whatever you have a question, just get out paper and start experimenting. This is how you learn. Appropriate that knowledge for yourself. Don't just read about it or watch it done. So important. Okay, now, part 2 is I wanted to go in and show you how I like to use this effect. And it is a useful effect. All right, so there's a couple ways that I like to use this as an effect. One of them is something I call wet lifting. I use it a lot in trees, tree lines, underbrush, clouds. We're just going to paint sort of a general wet in wet sort of a tree shape here. It's very rough, loose. I'm on a bit of an incline here, but that should give you a little less glare. And we'll get some dark tones in here, just sort of some undershadows. Now for the lifting, the wet lifting effect, I just come in with clear water. That's important. Decide where I want highlights. This works for clouds as well. You're essentially doing a controlled back run. You may have heard me refer to that in many of my episodes. And this is how you're doing it. Painting with clear water. And a little bit of a back run occurs. And before it becomes a serious back run, I'm just going in, dabbing the water out of my brush and picking up some of the moisture. So that just controls the spread. You can't see me, but I'm going over here, dipping my brush in water, getting a lot of water, putting a lot of water. You can get too much, obviously. Putting a lot of water down, taking water out, picking it up. Essentially wet lifting. Now you can go back in if these areas look too whitish to you, and you can glaze color. And voila, you have a tree. Kind of a wild looking tree, but mainly wanted to just make sure you can see that effect really clearly. So when I talk about wet lifting or intentional back runs, that's what I'm talking about. Another thing that you've probably seen me do or heard me do in episodes is painting a background, or doing, especially when I'm doing these spontaneous paintings. So I'm painting along nice and spontaneously, wishy-washy, whatever. Let's get some nice dark colors in here, so hopefully I'll be able to see it. And then basically I just want to give it some time to soak into the paper a little bit, create that backwash circumstance or conditions. Oops, I almost forgot to push record. So all I've done is that wash started to dry. It was turning a little more matte finish, and I just spattered some clear water into it. And you can use a brush with clear water and spatter that way, or you can use a trigger sprayer that puts out spatter. And see up here, the wash has dried too much, so it's not going to create a back run. Here, the conditions were just perfect. So that creates really nice textures in landscape. I've used that many times. Again, just spattering clear water into a partially drying wash. And again, if this is just something you need to experiment with. Try it in trees, try it in tree lines or ground or clouds. Just try samples. Put it to the test. The more you know about things like backwashes and backruns, the more you'll be able to control it, the more you'll be able to use it or know what you can do with it. If you have it and don't want it, can you fix it? You've got to experiment with it. Once again, you have to appropriate this knowledge for yourself. All right, thank you, Minders. I appreciate you tuning in and watching. Hope that was helpful. Thank you ever so much, patrons. Thank you for making this content possible and supporting this channel. You guys are the best. We'll see everybody in the next episode. Bye-bye.